Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another one of our Why I Do Not Believe Bible studies, in which we shall be once again stepping on some toes and giving you the personal reasons why I do not subscribe to a particular belief system. Today's topic is going to be Zoroastrianism. Now, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, when's the last time you ran into a Zoroastrianist? Well, the answer to that question would be probably never. The majority of them are in India, and they're a very, very minor world religion as opposed to or compared to certain others. They were nearly obliterated by Islam in the 6th to 7th century, and the history on their belief is really shaky. However, because of a lot of popular, I guess the lack of a better term would be hipster theologians, in which they, in their pursuit of disproving Christianity, would turn to a religion that next to nobody knows anything about, or at least knows little enough about, to just assume what they're saying about it is true, and then use it as proof that Christianity is just basically a copied concept. Well, essentially, that is the reason why we're going to be going through this study today. Not necessarily to debunk Zoroastrianism. I think anyone who knows the basics would know why it's not a belief that one should subscribe to. However, the reasons why we're discussing this go beyond just Zoroastrianism, and it's for those reasons I encourage you to keep listening. If you can turn to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8, Paul the Apostle, speaking to the church in Corinth, is essentially laying down his credentials, why you should believe Christianity, and the historical evidence that backs that belief up. Paul speaking says, "For I first delivered to you of that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures." So he's referencing something in the past that he fulfilled. "That he was seen by Cephas," that's the nickname of Peter, "then by the 12, referring to the apostles, and after that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep," referring to their term that would be referring to their deaths. "After that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles, then last of all he was seen by me also," Paul speaking, "as one born out of due time." So all of these eyewitnesses to the historical claim that Jesus not only died, and there are non-Christians who would affirm that as well, but also that he rose from the dead, and that this all is in alignment with the Scriptures that came before him. Now, essentially, what we're going to do as far as how this relates to Zoroastrianism isn't like Islam, and where they would make claims that can be debunked historically, or even necessarily what we did with Mormonism or JWs, in that they've set a standard for themselves that they couldn't keep. What we're going to do is we're going to hold Zoroastrianism to these standards and beliefs, but more in line with the way that it's come to the forefront, basically. The idea that it's a origin of the Christian belief. So we'll test its coherency, its clarity, and ultimately this idea of its consistency in laying down not only the belief in and of itself, but also the idea that because it's an older religion, because it predates Christianity, and because it apparently has some things in common with Christianity, therefore Christianity is based on Zoroastrianism. That is the claim that we'll be addressing most specifically today. Now let's start with the claims of Zoroastrianism. Let's start with their own, of course. I think it's fair to start with the religion before what atheists and internet trolls are doing with it. The belief of Zoroastrianism, or rather its founder, is named Zarathustra. His Greek name was Zoroaster, so that's what it's more commonly known as. And he was born around the 5th century BC, so that would be 500 years before Christ, or as the modern textbooks are trying to alter it, to the before our common era. So as far as how we're relating to it today, that would be 2,500 years ago, a long time. And its claims are fairly uninspired. They believe in this concept of dualism. You are familiar with the concept of a duel, a battle between two people, duo, and the idea of it being two, that there are two primary gods, and their names are Mazd and Ahriman. And these two gods essentially embody good and evil. One surrendered to the other, or Mazd, surrendered to Ahriman for 3,000 years in order to create the world and all the living things on it, the sun, the moon, all these other different things. Now, as far as how they did so, it's not the Christian idea in which God practiced his divine prerogative to command things into existence. You do not want to know how they accomplished this, but if you really, really want to, just leave it in the comments and encourage children not to read it. The next 3,000 years in the belief were essentially the era that we're in right now, that Ormazd and Ahriman are now in a stalemate. They're on an equal power footing that ultimately isn't going to go anywhere. Evil and good will remain in balance. And then the 3,000 years after that will be when Ormazd gains the upper hand on Ahriman, when evil will ultimately be dominated by good, and the next 3,000 years he will rule over this world and things will be wonderful, and Ahriman will eventually lose his power. Now, as in wonderful, it would mean that the volcano essentially consumes this world. To the good people, it'll just be like, milk running across your skin, but for evil people, it would burn them literally like lava. And there's other things as far as all this is concerned, but that's beside the point. The thing that Zoroastrians are to do right now is to basically live in this time where good and evil are at this stalemate. And the only thing we can do is to combat our inner demons based on basically balancing man's passions with the morals that Zoroaster or Zarathustra, I have trouble pronouncing the Iranian name, so I'll probably just stick to the former, Zoroaster's values that he laid down in his vision that ultimately will maintain this stalemate until Ormazd is able to turn the tide. How did Zoroastrianism come to be? What's the great origin of what made up Zoroastrianism? Well, this man, Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, went to draw water out of a well that was known as the Dati well, I believe, the Dati River, rather, in ancient Babylon. And while he was doing so, he received a vision. That's it. It's a little bit in common with Buddhism, but that's why they were able to integrate so well into India. When we're talking about all these things, though, it's not just the dualist belief. It's not just this cosmic battle of the ages in which good is starting in the losing position but eventually overpowers evil. All these different things. But the real reason why it's coming up in our modern day isn't because there's not a lot of Zoroastrians, but because it predates Christianity. 500 BC, 1st century AD. There's a difference there. And because they assume that there are some concepts in common with Christianity, that therefore, since they predate them, these are the ancient origins of what ultimately made up Christianity. And that would include the idea of resurrection, salvation, creation, a sacrificial God, all of these things that make up the Christian belief. These are most well known in the Zeitgeist film, as well as those who subscribe to the Jesus myth theory. Now, that's all well and good to say on paper, but let's actually look at the content and see if that lines up with history. Is this belief consistent? Historically, no. The claim that Zoroastrianism, as we know it today, predates Christian beliefs, we're defining our terms here, are based entirely on two factors. Meaning, if I was to make that claim, two things are required. I need to know nothing about Christianity, and I need to know nothing about Zoroastrianism, which the internet is full of. It's probably why this was able to circulate for so long. The only and earliest written account of what Zoroastrian belief actually is dates to the 4th century AD. Now, for those of you who are keeping track at home and have a basic understanding of church history, you would also already start to put the numbers out of order there. But then you'd also have to realize that even though, and let me get the name of the account here, the Avesta, as well as several other accounts as well. But this Avesta was put into writing. The earliest we can date it to is the 4th century AD. So 400 years in the modern era, not BC. 400 years after Jesus had established himself. But what's also interesting about this is that in the 2 to 3 centuries that took place in between the 4th and the 7th century, the Zoroastrians could not agree as to not only when their founder was born, but ultimately what their beliefs actually were. We have a wide variety of the different practices and rituals, the basic concepts, and the mythos behind all of these things. And when we're talking about the basic foundation of what Zoroastrianism was, Islam had already swept it under the rug, and all of its followers had to migrate, or rather flee for their lives, to India. And this was essentially where they remained quiet until another 1,000 years had passed, until 1400 AD, modern era time, that they started actually producing literature again. And it's based on these things that we then conclude, or are able to really conclude anything about what the religion, what the belief actually is. So at best, Zoroastrianism's beliefs are shaky because it's entirely dependent on sources that occur almost 1,000 years after what some claim were the origins of their belief. And likewise, those sources differ. The other thing that needs to be pointed out as far as the historical inconsistency is going back to the atheist claim. Christianity began in the 1st century AD. That is 500 years after, in which the majority of modern interpreters of Zoroastrianism would claim that their founder was born and began preaching. Now, this isn't based on any proof that we have that he exists, but because of the very idea that we have archaeological evidence of the temples dedicated to this god, or Mazd and Ahriman and all these other different things. We can't be certain that's what was being worshipped, but we can make the association 1,000 years beforehand that because these guys practicing 1,000 years after the fact may have something in common with these ancient temples that were existent during that time. But once again, going back to the idea of Christianity, because it came after Zoroastrianism, that somehow because Zoroastrianism also teaches those concepts, it was the one who had them originally. Well, time out. Let's check those dates again. Christianity began in the 1st century AD, where Jesus of Nazareth was acclaimed by the eyewitnesses to his resurrection to have proved himself as God. And after enduring severe persecution, they spread throughout the entire Roman Empire. Christian literature had circulated underground and had become more plentiful during this time, even in spite of the centuries of being basically lifted out to the Roman public as people who would be eaten alive and impaled on pikes and set on fire as street lamps for sport and entertainment. And all these people who were enduring this kind of persecution held onto this belief as reality until the Edict of Toleration was passed, and it became the most popular and well-known belief in the Roman Empire, even above the ancient Greek and Roman pagan myths. So, if I'm going to note these numbers correctly, type it in my calculator here. By 300 AD, Christianity had essentially spread throughout the Roman Empire and was more well-known than any other belief system in the Roman Empire. Now again, that's speaking loosely, but once again, it was known throughout the modern world. Then, all of a sudden, Zoroastrianism produces its first written account of what its beliefs could have been, and for some reason has something in common with Christianity. Methinks someone actually was basing it on our beliefs. And that's not based on my biases, that's just based on the available information that we have. Because when I'm looking at all of these things, understand that if you're going to at least dismiss this and saying, well, I guess by the time the Zoroastrians, this is a hard word to say, stepped up, they were pointing out 100 years after everyone knew about Christianity that they were the ones who actually came up with these origins and beliefs. Not so fast. Because remember that Christianity's core beliefs aren't based on the teachings of the disciples. They're based on Judaism. Judeo-Christian belief, the idea that the Old Testament predicted the coming of the Christ, who was shown to be Jesus based on not only the prophecies he fulfilled in his life, but also in his death and the resurrection that subsequently occurred and confirmed him as the only one being worth listening to about the afterlife. Going into a separate topic on that. But also understand as well the beliefs of Judaism. Do they predate, even if we were to assume the best of the Zoroastrians, that they were being honest about Zoroaster being born in the 5th century BC? Do his beliefs predate Judaism? Unfortunately not, because the most clear, well-known, and prominent ideas of what the Christ would do, setting up this idea that set the foundation for the core beliefs of Christianity, are all found in the book of Isaiah, which is dated back to 700 BC, 200 years before Zoroaster was supposedly born. Likewise, the very concepts that Isaiah clarifies in his prophecies were introduced to the Jewish people in the book of Psalms, which was written 1000 BC, 500 years before Zoroaster came on the scene. And if it couldn't get any better, also understand where the concept of the Christ originally came from. We would find this in the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which are dated back to 1400 BC. That is almost 1,000 years before Zoroaster was born. So just understand this. Your dates are wrong in who came first. Going on from here. We've been talking a lot about the atheist claim, but this video is about Zoroastrianism, so I may as well be fair in that regard. Also addressing Zoroastrianism as a belief, because I think we fairly debunked the idea of it actually being before Christianity, that it came up with somehow these concepts of a God who would sacrifice himself to result in mankind's salvation from evil. Absolutely a ridiculous claim. But also understand as well, Zoroastrianism's claim of a consistent belief historically is on more shaky ground than even what we've already talked about. Because understand this, it's all based on the testimony of one man. Same problem that we talked about with Islam. Either it all stands or falls on that one man. Now, I'm more than willing to put my faith in the person of Jesus Christ, but understand the witness of Jesus Christ isn't the only thing that sets the foundation for the Christian belief, because Jesus didn't just have a vision of our spiritual reality, told us all it, and then it was all based on whether or not he was lying or not. He did something a little bit more dramatic, but he wasn't the only eyewitness to these things. Now, was he? Zoroaster gives us no records of any sort of persecution, any sort of challenge to his belief until literally, let's see, it would be 1400 AD, 2,000 years after the events would have taken place. So essentially anything that could be compared to the amount of testing, the amount of reasons why the Christians would have wanted to abandon their belief, as compared to the Zoroastrians, if they knew that it was a lie. Because understand as well, when Paul wrote that verse that we read at the start of this study, we were talking about a man who had left the most prominent spiritual and political role that you could possibly have in and among the Jewish people. and that was being a member of the Sanhedrin, the spiritually elite group of Pharisees, people who memorized the entire Old Testament. For those of you know, that's a long book. People who had gone out of their way to basically dedicate their entire lives to keeping the law of Moses, all 600 plus commandments. And when we're talking about all these things, we're looking at a man who left all of that behind based on a personal encounter with the risen Jesus, after at first being someone who hunted down and murdered Christians for a living. But that wasn't the only thing that Christianity had going for it that Zoroastrianism wasn't put through. Because remember, Zoroaster didn't face persecution for these things. He claimed to have a spiritual revelation. Some believed, some didn't, but ultimately grew to prominence, and he was living large in ultimately modeling his virtues. We see the same with Islam. We see the same with Mormonism. We see the same in all of these false beliefs, things that we have given reason not to believe. When we're talking about Christianity, by comparison, understand it's not all based on just one man's testimony. One man's action, for sure, but who bore witness to that action? Did more than 500 people bear witness to Zoroaster having his vision and confirm that it was a direct spiritual encounter, and see this ongoing production of just impacting this world for the better as the result of Zoroastrianism? Maybe a few temples, but that's about it. On the other hand, when I look at Christianity, we have the eyewitness testimonies of 500 people. And these 500 people who at the same time were able to witness, interact with, and confirm that Jesus was dead and had then been seen and touched and felt and heard and known after his confirmed crucifixion. They then went on to be exiled from their communities, tortured by those they formerly called family and their own citizens, and finally being willing to endure the most grisly deaths imaginable, all for the sake of simply teaching this is true. Now, it's one thing to die for a lie. You can be convinced by a liar, but if you're the liar, you're not going to give up your life for that belief if you know that it's false. The eyewitnesses were the ones who went to their graves, simply proclaiming, as they stated in Acts, the things that they had seen and heard. So when they're talking about this test as to whether or not the belief of Christianity is a sincere one, understand the amount of testing that went into all of this. And not just as far as that truck backing up behind me. When we're talking about the beliefs of Christians, let's just take it from Paul the Apostle, since he's the topic of the conversation. A man who left a role of prominence, a man who left his culture behind, was willing to be literally exiled from his society, literally beheaded at the hands of the country with whom he was formerly a citizen and enjoying the benefits of. And all for what? Because he started some new prominent belief and was living large? Here's how he was living large. 2 Corinthians 11, verses 24 through 27. From the Jews, 5 times I've received 40 stripes minus 1. Do you remember the Passion of the Christ? Remember when Jesus was whipped? Paul went through that 5 times. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned with rocks, not weed. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep, meaning he was just floating out there in the ocean. In journeys often, in perils of waters, perils of robbers, perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, people who called themselves Christians but weren't. In weariness and toil, in sleeplessness, often. In hunger and thirst, in fastings, often. In cold and nakedness. A great life, don't you think? And all of this he was willing to gladly endure. For what? Because he understood that it's not about this life, it's what's been proven is waiting for me in the next. He gave his life for me, and I saw it. Now I'm willing to do the same for him. I think that's enough on consistency. Let's move on to coherency. Is Zoroastrianism as a belief morally coherent? The answer to that is no. The reason for that is because God is the foundation of morality. He is the standard, whatever that is, whatever your God is. Maybe it's your own feelings, but that is the definition of what you call good, and also what you call not good. God is your standard for good. And if you have a dualist mentality behind ultimately what your system of deities are, and understand that Ormazd and Ahriman aren't the only gods in Zoroastrianism. You can make the note and follow along historically where the Persians introduced theirs and so on and so forth, but it was originally, and set in this base at its core, a polytheistic belief, but with two primary gods. And let's just assume that for the sake of argument. This dualist belief ultimately puts forward no better reasoning for siding with Ahriman than you would with Ormazd. Now understand as well, I think we've looked at the historical evidence and come to conclude that they borrowed a lot from Christianity and not vice versa. But also understand why Ormazd and what they adopted from Christianity is the only way that it would ever make sense. Ormazd is only the better option in that because of the adaptations of following Christianity, the one God, the one definition of what is good, that's the only consistent belief in a deity, let alone coherent. Because since we all only have to go on the Zoroastrian temple, since we only are able to know what is written down in the Avesta, as well as what was later confirmed by the Indian writings 1,000 years later, we're talking about basically a concept of these two deities, and I emphasize that point, two deities, two gods, that only give us the ability to conclude that either one or the other is good. They claim that Ormazd is good because he wins in the end, but understand as well that's not only a misrepresentation, but an obvious adaptation of Christianity. And again, I emphasize this is just speculation on my part. What was more than likely is that this was cyclical. That every so amount of years, they would have a time where Ahriman was victorious, then they'd go into a stalemate, then Tammuz, then it'd go back, and so on and so forth. But they made a conclusive claim. Why? Because they were thinking people. People back in the ancient days weren't morons. They were just more active than we were. And when we're talking about all of these interesting concepts about Ahriman and Ormazd, why is Ormazd the good god and why is Ahriman the bad god? Well, essentially it's because he wins in the end. But in reality, let's just look at this honestly. You can't form any other conclusion beyond this cycle that ultimately goes as to which god is good or not, and here's why. If I call Ahriman bad and Ormazd good, but call them both God, I am literally speaking of a contradiction in terms, because God is the definition of good. Just like the Roman or Greek pantheons, the only God that was good is whatever you ultimately chose was the kind of bad habit you wanted justified. And that was essentially what the real gods were. It was their feelings. Feel free to request that if you want me to debunk it too. That'll be a lot of reading, but nonetheless, a lot of fun to discuss historically. Ahriman is bad because he loses. Not exactly a sure foundation. But also understand as well, Ormazd's future 3,000 years of peace, based on this philosophical concept of God, is no more good than Ahriman's past 3,000 years of dominance. Why? Because they are both from the gods. They are both the definitions of good. Let me just lay this out. Ahriman, according to their mythos, ruled for 3,000 years. This was the start. The result was that he created all living things. Don't ask me how. And he's the evil one. We're in the stalemate. Then Ormazd is going to rule for 3,000 years in the future. And what is ultimately accomplished? He destroys everyone that isn't on his side. And he's the good one. What ultimately is your standard of comparison? What was the only reason that you can say that Ormazd is the good one? Well, you'd have to either say Ormazd came first, that Ahriman is going in rebellion to the foundation of God, the foundation of good, then you'd have a case in making out which one was good or evil. But understand, in a dualist world, Ahriman's actions are in no way different than if Ormazd was to do the same thing. Why? Because they're both called good or evil on the same authority. It's just basically going to end up splitting your head in half, ironically. So understand this. Even if you blame the conclusion, or rather the confusion, on the stalemate that we currently find ourselves in, that only makes the issue more confusing. If Ahriman's power put Ormazd in a stalemate, it's either because they borrowed from Judeo-Christian concepts of mercy and free will on Ormazd's part in allowing Ahriman to do these things, or it's contradictory, because you wouldn't be able to call one good above the other. Ormazd essentially is the evil one right now because Ahriman has more of a foothold on what ultimately would be called the dominant god. He's just trying to catch up, and even then, if he rules for 3,000 years longer than Ahriman, they're essentially the same thing. They've ruled for 3,000 years. And understand as well where the concept of Zoroastrianism comes from culturally. Ancient Iran. And if we're talking about the Middle East and these people that ultimately populated these different regions, and they would go by different names, they'd prefer to be called Persians. But understand this. What did Ahriman ultimately do? He killed the primordial man and woman, and from parts of them made the sun and the stars and the plants and all these other different things. But understand as well, why is Ormazd good? Because he wins in the end? Well, isn't that essentially saying that the view of good is the chief that kills me less? That's actually a pretty common belief among the Bedouins and the Middle Eastern tribes and so forth. And I just threw Bedouins out as a generic name, but understand this. If you want a new chief of the universe that's going to kill you less, that might make sense to someone living in the ancient BC-ish desert, but that's not going to exactly win over in the realm of philosophy, in the realm of reality. So understand that. And I think that that's enough that needs to be talked about. Let's just be clear. With the historical evidence of Zoroastrianism being absent until after Christianity was popularized in the known world, we can conclude that the claim of it being the origin of Judeo-Christian belief is false. And likewise, with the moral dilemma that a dualist theology puts you in, it can't be the true religion if you would ever dare to believe in a concept called good. That's why I don't believe in Zoroastrianism.